예성 씨가 사람들을 구했어요. 그러다가 대표를 따라 대기실 안으로 들어가는 것까지 봤어요.
아니 그래서 뭐 어쩌자고. 여기서 한 발자국 못 움직이는데 3층까지 가자고? 아니 거기까지 어떻게 가는데요?
이거 어디다 놔요? 여기.
자, 단톡방에 초대했으니까 확인을 해봐요.
구동이 가져와.
있습니다. 이렇게 물바다를 만들어서 통신망을 끄는 건 권세정 교수님이시죠?
뭐야? 뭐 둘이 아는 사이야?
실수하신 거예요.
불러요. 들읍니다. 이제 어떡할 거야?
현석아, 이 건물 전체 CCTV 볼 수 있는 통제실 어딨어?
There is a moment in colony when moment stops looking individual. A body reacts, another follows, then several more seem to answer the same invisible instruction. And the room begins to feel less like a place filled with separate creatures than a single organism learning how to move. That is the image I keep returning to. Not simply the infected running or closing distance, but the unsettling instant when many bodies begin to behave like one thought. Yeon Sang-ho builds the film's new zombie logic around collective intelligence, with the infected learning and adapting as a group rather than existing only as isolated predators. That idea gives the film its most distinctive pulse. This is the scent, flux scent, if you come here, because cinema means more to you than plot, more than ratings, more than deciding whether something was merely good or bad, then stay with me for a while. Because Colony becomes more interesting when you stop asking how frightening its monsters are and start asking what it feels like to watch individuality disappear in real time. The infected are frightening because they are fast. They are frightening because their bodies move with a physicality that feels almost choreographed. But speed is not the deepest disturbance here. coordination is. The film imagines a threat that does not become powerful by producing one perfect monster. It becomes powerful by connecting imperfect bodies. One learns, the others inherit that learning. One failure becomes information for the whole. Reviews and interviews around the film have highlighted that hive-like intelligence and the practical, dancer-driven physical design used to give it shape, and that changes the emotional temperature of the familiar zombie movie. Usually, survival horror gives us a comforting division even when everything else collapses. There is the self and there is the crowd. There is your mind, your choice, your fear, your instinct. Then there is the mass outside the door. Colony makes that boundary unstable. Its central image asks what happens when the mass does not merely surround you but begins to think faster because it is a mass. Suddenly, the crowd is not the opposite of intelligence. The crowd is intelligence. That is where the film becomes more than a machine for panic. What this film understands is that one of the quiet anxieties of modern life is not simply that technology might become smarter than us, it is that connection itself can begin to flatten difference. The more efficiently information moves, the easier it becomes for reactions to repeat and behavior to converge. Yeon has openly connected colonies' collective intelligence to contemporary anxieties around artificial intelligence and the erosion of individuality. But the film does not turn that idea into a lecture. It gives it muscles. It gives it feet hitting polished floors. It gives it bodies changing their behavior. It gives it poses in which the infected seem less like a chaotic mob and more like a system waiting for information. The sterile corridors and controlled spaces noted by festival critics matter because order is already built into the environment before the outbreak destroys it. White hallways, regulated movement, corporate architecture, these are spaces designed to make people pass through efficiently. Then the infection creates a different kind of efficiency. That visual echo is where colony becomes fascinating to me. The building wants organization, the infected want organization, the authorities outside want containment. The survivors, meanwhile, are trying to preserve something messier, the right to remain separate people making separate choices, and maybe that is why the title matters so much. A colony can be a place, a population, or life organized around a collective structure where the individual matters less than the behavior of the whole. Colony turns that word into a pressure point. Every time the infected become more synchronized, the film quietly asks whether survival is only about keeping your body alive or whether it's something equally important in keeping your mind your own. I gave Colony an 8 out of 10, and that score comes with both admiration and resistance. I admire the film most when its physical imagination and its central idea become inseparable, when choreography itself carries meaning. I resist it when the human drama does not always deepen as quickly as the concept around it, but even those uneven moments become part of what makes the film worth sitting with, because the strongest thing here is not a single scare or burst of spectacle. It is the question embedded in the movement. When many bodies begin to think together, what happens to the value of one person refusing to move with them? That is the path I want us to follow. Not a checklist of zombie rules, not a scene-by-scene reconstruction. We are going to follow the film from image to rhythm, from rhythm to emotional echo, and from that echo into something uncomfortably human. We will look at the world that produced a film like this, the history Yeon Sang-ho carries into it, the way the camera treats bodies and space, and the places where the screenplay's ideas outrun the people carrying them. Because before Colony becomes a story about survival inside a sealed building, it belongs to a much larger moment, a moment obsessed with networks, automation, shared information, and the fear that connection can become conformity. And that is where we need to begin. 10 years before Colony reached Cannes, Yeon Sang-ho had already turned the train into one of modern horror's most memorable social pressure chambers. Train to Busan arrived at Cannes in 2016, and Peninsula followed in 2020. So when Konani entered the 2026 festival as an out-of-competition midnight screening, it did not feel like a filmmaker discovering this territory for the first time. It felt like a filmmaker returning to an old wound to see what had changed around it, and a great deal had changed. The zombie movie has always borrowed the anxieties of its moment. Sometimes the infected resemble consumer appetite. Sometimes they embody fear of disease, social collapse, institutional failure, or the terror of seeing ordinary people reduced to instinct. Colony arrives in a culture where their anxiety is no longer only about infections spreading between bodies. We live in a world increasingly shaped by systems that learn from enormous pools of human behavior, by recommendation engines that anticipate what we might want, and by artificial intelligence that can absorb patterns from millions of examples almost instantly. Yeon has explained that the conceptual starting point for this film was AI, and what he saw as a movement toward universalized thinking, which led him toward the opposing idea of individuality. That connection is important because it explains why these infected do not merely multiply, they accumulate. One creature fails, but the group becomes more capable. One body discovers something, and the knowledge no longer seems to belong to that body alone. The old zombie image was frightening because individuality disappeared into appetite. Colony updates that fear. Here, individuality disappears into information. That is the very 2026 kind of nightmare. And yet Yeon does not abandon the older social instincts that have always made his genre work interesting. His monsters are still most useful when they expose the systems around them. A Seoul building becomes more than a location. It becomes a diagram of modern organization, security, corporate hierarchy, scientific expertise, emergency authority, communication networks, and frightened individuals all trying to decide who should be trusted when the rules stop working. The infected may become a colony, but the humans are already surrounded by structures that ask them to function as parts of something larger. The question is whether structures protect individuality or quietly erase it. That gives Colony an interesting position inside contemporary Korean genre cinema as well. It arrived with enormous international expectation attached to Yeon's name, but not because the film was entering the main Cannes competition. Cannes programmed it in midnight screenings out of competition, a space that suited a film built around propulsion, horror, and spectacle rather than awards competition. The festival itself placed Colony within a longer history of zombie cinema that has appeared on its screens. There is something almost circular about that. Train to Busan had established Yeon internationally through Cannes. A decade later, Colony returned him to the same festival, carrying both the advantage and the burden of recognition. A new Yeon Sang-ho zombie film can no longer arrive as a surprise. It arrives as a comparison before anyone has even watched it. The audience is not simply asking whether Colony works. It is asking whether Jung can make the infected feel new again, whether he can recover the emotional precision associated with his earlier success, whether there is still unexplored territory inside a genre that has been repeatedly pronounced exhausted. That burden shaped the early reception. The critical response was not unified. Variety responded positively to the film's inventive mechanics and practical physicality. Screen Daily found it propulsive and entertaining, while ultimately describing the experience as forgettable. IndieWire was more skeptical, arguing that its portrait of collapse operated with too broad a brush, and that disagreement interests me more than any simple average score. Because it reveals exactly where Colony's central tension lies, the film has an idea that is immediately legible. Collective intelligence is a strong hook. Evolving infected are a strong hook. A sealed skyscraper is a wonderfully clean pressure chamber. The difficulty is turning those hooks into something emotionally lasting. Spectacle can demonstrate the concept in seconds. Character takes longer, and the marketplace had already demonstrated how powerful the concept was before audiences at Cannes had even seen the finished film. Screen Daily reported that Showbox had pre-sold Colony to more than 120 territories ahead of its Cannes premiere, with deals spanning major international markets. That does not prove artistic success, but it does show how globally legible both Yeon's name and the language of the zombie film remain. The genre travels remarkably well. You do not need to share the same politics, technology, or social history to understand a door that will not hold, a corridor that is becoming unsafe, or a group realizing that the threat outside has learned something new. Fear travels easily, meaning travels differently, and here is what I keep returning to. Colony arrives at a moment when the word intelligence itself has become emotionally unstable. Intelligence once sounded intensely individual, something belonging to a mind, a person, a singular consciousness. Now we increasingly speak about intelligence as something distributed across networks, models, databases, and systems. Yeon's infected made that shift physical. Their bodies are disturbing not simply because they have lost human control, but because control appears to have moved somewhere else. No single creature needs to be fully in command. Yet the collective becomes more capable. Think about what that means. The film's deepest contemporary anxiety is not that everyone will become stupid together. It is almost the opposite. The colony may become more efficient as the individual becomes less important. That distinction separates colony from a simpler outbreak fantasy. The nightmare is not chaos without intelligence. The nightmare is intelligence without selfhood. And this is where the movie feels both perfectly of its moment and potentially more durable than its immediate technological references. AI is the contemporary language Yeon himself used when discussing the film, but conformity is much older than AI. Crowds have always pressured people to imitate. Institutions have always rewarded obedience. Societies have always struggled with the balance between collective survival and individual difference. Technology simply accelerates the metaphor. So I would not call Colony timeless yet. It is too clearly marked by the anxieties of the mid-2020s, artificial intelligence, rapid information exchange, collective learning, and the increasingly blurry boundary between individual choice and systems designed to anticipate it. But that specificity is not necessarily a weakness. Sometimes a genre film becomes valuable precisely because it preserves the nervous system of the year that meet it. Colony preserves a world asking a strange new question. What if the thing becoming smarter is not you or me or even one machine? What if intelligence belongs to the crowd? And once you see the film through that lens, its skyscraper stops being merely a place where an outbreak happens. It becomes a miniature society in which every person is forced to decide whether survival means joining a system, resisting one, trusting expertise, protecting somebody else, or remaining stubbornly separate when separation itself may be dangerous. That is the world this film was born into. Now we can finally step inside the building. So we step inside the building. Colony, originally titled Gunchi, is a 2026 South Korean action horror film written and directed by Yeon Sang-ho, the filmmaker behind Train to Busan, Seoul Station, and Peninsula. Cannes presented it in its midnight screenings program, listing the film at roughly 2 hours in length. At the center of the ensemble is ji-hyun, also known internationally as Jana-jeon, alongside Koo Kyo-wan, Ji Chang-wook, Kim Shin-rock, Shin Hyun-bin, and Go-soo. But those facts tell you almost nothing about the sensation of watching it. The film begins from a premise that sounds deceptively familiar. Se-jeong, a biotechnology professor, played by Ji-hyun, finds herself inside a Seoul building when a biotechnology gathering collapses into an outbreak. The contamination spreads, authorities seal the structure, and the people trapped inside discover that whatever they are facing refuses to remain biologically predictable. Se-jeong's scientific background becomes important because observation itself becomes a survival skill. These infected are not static creatures obeying one permanent rule. They change. They communicate. They begin behaving collectively. That is all you really need to know before watching. Because the pleasure of colony is not in learning a complicated mythology beforehand. It is in entering with one assumption and slowly realizing that the film is rewriting the rules while you are still trying to understand them. At first, you lets the architecture do much of the work. A skyscraper in downtown Seoul is almost an ideal setting for this particular idea. Its corridors divide people. Elevators connect levels, while also becoming potential traps. Glass lets you see danger without necessarily reaching it. Offices, laboratories, conference spaces, and service passages turn vertical space into a collection of temporary islands. Everyone may be trapped inside the same building, but they are not necessarily trapped together. And this matters because Colony is ultimately fascinated by the difference between proximity and connection. The humans begin scattered. The infected increasingly do not. That reversal gives the movie its personality. Ji-hyun's Se-jeong provides the film with its clearest human point of orientation. She is not simply positioned as somebody who can run faster than danger. Her usefulness comes from watching and recognizing patterns and refusing to treat each new infected behavior as meaningless chaos. John described the screenplay as lean and character-driven. While reporting around the film identifies Se-jeong's research into superorganisms as central to how she begins interpreting the evolving threat. That is a clever choice because it changes what competence looks like in an action horror film. Knowledge does not automatically make Se-jeong safe, it makes her capable of asking better questions. Woo Kyo-wan occupies a very different energy within the same biological nightmare, while Ji Chang-wook, Kim Shin-rook, Shin Yeon-bin, and Go-soo expand the human map around the outbreak. I do not want to unpack their trajectories yet, because colony works better when you discover which relationships become important under pressure rather than being handed an emotional diagram before the film begins. What matters at this stage is that Yeon builds a group in which scientific knowledge, physical vulnerability, responsibility, fear, and self-interest are constantly colliding. And hovering over all of them is the film's real star. Movement. Watch how quickly Colony teaches you to study bodies, not faces, bodies. A shoulder turning, a creature dropping you toward the floor, several infected suddenly becoming still, a repeated physical response moving through the group. The film trains you to notice these things because the infected are not merely obstacles, they are a developing language. Their behavior becomes something the characters must read. And once you begin reading it too, the action gains another layer. A chase is no longer only a chase, it is evidence. A failed escape is information. A moment of stillness can be more threatening than movement because stillness may mean the colony is processing what just happened. That is where Yeon's concept separates the film from hundreds of other Drake stories. You are not simply watching humans learn how monsters behave. You are watching monsters learn how humans behave, and that exchange creates a wonderfully unstable rhythm. Every small victory carries the possibility that the survivors have just demonstrated the method that will eventually defeat them. So should you watch Colony? For me, yes. Especially if what you want from zombie cinema is not nostalgia for familiar rules, but the pleasure of seeing those rules bent into a new shape. The film is energetic, visually clear when it needs to be, and built around a genuinely strong central mechanism. Its 8 out of 10 from me does not mean every character receives the depth the premise deserves. And later we will talk seriously about where its emotional architecture becomes thinner than its conceptual one. But the invention is real, the physical imagination is real, and when Colony is fully locked into the rhythm of people desperately improvising while the infected quietly absorb the lesson, it produces a form of tension that belongs specifically to this movie. Still, knowing the premise is different from feeling the opening, because before the colony fully reveals what it can become, the film has to make us experience that building as ordinary space. It has to let normal movement establish itself first. Only then can it make movement feel wrong. The first thing Colony does well is refuse to pretend that familiarity is a problem it can solve by slowing down. Yeon Sang-ho knows exactly what kind of expectations surround a film like this. The moment you hear biotechnology, quarantine, infection, and the name of the director behind Train to Busan, an entire library of genre memories begins assembling itself before the movie has done anything. You expect warning signs. You expect somebody to make the mistake that cannot be undone. You expect containment to fail. You expect running. So rather than spending half an hour pretending those expectations do not exist, Colony moves toward the outbreak quickly. The film introduces Se-jeong, Young-cheol, Gyu-seong, the security personnel, and several other figures around the biotechnology conference before the biological threat is released and the facility begins closing around them. Contemporary reviews noted how little time Yeon wastes before pushing the story into crisis. That speed immediately establishes the movie's personality. This is not an open interested in dread through emptiness, it is interested in dread through acceleration. People are already moving through professional spaces, doors open and close. Work continues, conversations overlap, employees puff routines that seem completely ordinary because nobody yet understands that routine is about to become useless. The emotional trick is not to make the building feel haunted before anything happens. The building feels functional. that normality matters. Because once the infection appears, functionality becomes panic with the same architecture around it. The corridors have not changed. The elevators have not changed. The walls have not changed. What changes is the meaning of movement through them. A hallway that previously connected one room to another suddenly becomes exposure. A door becomes a calculation. A staircase becomes a possible route or a possible funnel. The architecture is still doing exactly what it was designed to do, but human interpretation of that architecture changes almost instantly. And that is the first place where I began feeling the film rather than simply recognizing its genre. Yeon has always understood that enclosed space become interesting when that practical purpose turns against the people inside them. A train moves forward whether its passengers are ready or not. A tower organizes people vertically whether those people want to be separated or not. In Colony, the corporate building initially represents order. Then order becomes confinement. The opening therefore creates a peculiar emotional rhythm. Fast but not yet chaotic, controlled, then suddenly unstable. And after the infection begins spreading, the film's sound and physical performance take over much of the emotional work. The rap specifically praised the immersive sound design and the way the infected bodies contoured under the choreography, emphasizing that practical performers remain visibly central to the effect. That physicality is important because the first infected encounters do not feel frightening only because somebody has become dangerous, they feel wrong at the level of rhythm. Human movement has a grammar we understand instinctively. Even panic usually follows recognizable patterns. We stumble, we shield ourselves, we hesitate, we look for exits, we protect our faces, we recoil from pain. The infected begin breaking that grammar. Their bodies seem willing to accept positions, impacts, and directions that normal self preservation would reject. So, before the film fully explains what makes this outbreak unusual, it allows behavior itself to become the clue. You begin watching differently. At first, you watch to see who survives. Then you watch to understand how the infected moves. That shift is subtle, but it is crucial. Because Koreni is gradually teaching you that observation matters as much as escape. And Se-jeong fits naturally into that rhythm. She does not need to become an invulnerable action figure for the film to give her authority. Her scientific background makes pattern recognition meaningful. Khanna's official synopsis establishes her as a biotechnology professor trapped after the rapidly mutating virus is released and the facility is sealed. So when the film begins revealing that the infected are not behaving consistently, her perspective becomes one of the story's most useful tools. That creates a nice tension between what the genre promises and what the film actually delivers. The premise promises velocity. The opening gives us velocity. But beneath that speed, the movie is quietly constructing a film about noticing. What changed? Why did that creature react differently? Did one infected learn something? Did the others respond? Can a tactic work twice? Those questions begin forming almost invisibly beneath the action, and this is where my initial response to Colony became more engaged than I expected. Not because the opening reinvented outbreak cinema from the ground up, it does not. There are recognizable ingredients everywhere. The conference, the compromised facility, the sudden collapse of safety, the survivors pulled together by circumstance, the authorities attempting containment. You have seen variations of these things before. What kept the matter alive for me was the sensation that the movie understood this familiarity and was preparing to mutate it rather than deny it. That distinction matters. A genre film does not always need to invent a completely new language. Sometimes it needs to change one rule strongly enough that every familiar rule around it begins behaving differently. And the first part of Colony gives us exactly that promise. The infected are not merely going to become more numerous, they are going to become more capable, which means every human solution may contain the seed of the next human problem. That idea changes the atmosphere immediately. In most survival stories, experience creates confidence. You discover what the threat cannot do, and the world becomes slightly more manageable. Here, experience carries another possibility. The threat may be discovering you at the same time. So while the opening begins with recognizable genre machinery, it leaves you with an increasingly uncomfortable feeling. The survivors are learning, but something on the other side is learning too. And that is when the film's rhythm begins to tighten. The most effective way to experience Colony is to stop thinking of its story as a straight line and begin thinking of it as an exchange of information. Humans act. The infected respond. Humans adjust. The infected remember. Once that rhythm establishes itself, almost every major sequence becomes another round in the same increasingly unfair conversation. The outbreak itself provides the first lesson. Professor Kwon Se-jeong arrives at the biotechnology event carrying professional frustration and an uncertain future rather than the instincts of an action hero. Her ex-husband Han Gyu-seong is part of the reason she is there, while other people inside the Dunguri Building have their own completely ordinary reasons for occupying the same space. Security guard Choi Hyun-seok is there with his responsibilities and his concern for his older sister Hyun-hee. None of these people enter the building expecting to become components in a survival experiment. Their lives simply happen to intersect at the exact place where So-young's biological experiment turns catastrophic. That ordinariness matters because Yeon does not begin with a heroic unit. He begins with fragments. People who know different things, people who care about different people whose immediate priorities do not naturally align. And that makes the humans, at least initially, the opposite of the creatures they are about to face. The survivors have individuality without coordination. The infected have almost no individuality at all, but they are slowly developing coordination. That contrast becomes the hidden structure beneath the action. At first, however, nobody understands that. The first encounters invite familiar responses: run, hide, close the door, find a route that the infected cannot follow. Reduce the problem to distance. Put enough architecture between your body and theirs, and perhaps you can buy another minute. The film lets those instincts work just well enough to make them dangerous, because every successful tactic teaches the survivors something about the threat, but it also exposes something about them. One of Colony's most useful early rules is the infected response to light. Festival reviews noted that these creatures display attraction to light alongside their unusually fast animal-like movement. In a conventional monster movie, discovering a behavioral rule like this would feel like progress. You have found the key. You now understand one reliable limit of the creature. But Colony refuses to let knowledge remain comforting for very long. That is where Se-jeong becomes essential. Her scientific value is not that she instantly provides an explanation. It is that she takes inconsistency seriously. Someone without her training might see an infected creature behaving differently and assume randomness. She sees a pattern that has changed. That distinction is everything. The scene repeatedly places its characters in situations where the most dangerous assumption is that yesterday's rule will remain tomorrow's rule. The infected are not a lock waiting for the correct key. They are a biological system capable of altering the lock after watching how you opened it. So the story develops through failed certainty. A route seems safe, then it is not. A behavior appears predictable, then something changes. A group believes it has gained a little control. Then the infected suddenly stop. And this stillness is one of the best ideas in the movie. Bodies that have been violently kinetic become unnervingly synchronized. The frantic movement disappears, heads lift. The collective seems to withdraw into itself for a moment. Reviews describe this episode as almost trance-like pauses in which the infected appear to process what has happened before emerging with newly shared behavioral knowledge. Think about how strange that feels in a zombie film. We are accustomed to fearing movement. Colony teaches us to fear the pause. The pause means something may be changing. The pause means the chase you just survived may not happen the same way next time. The pause means victory has become data. And when the infected move again, there is a slightly different intelligence inside the rhythm. The image I mentioned at the beginning of this essay now starts acquiring another meaning. At first, synchronized movement was simply disturbing because individual bodies seem to disappear into one group. Now, synchronization becomes memory. One body does not need to survive an encounter for the encounter to matter. The colony survives it. That changes the mathematics of the entire building. The humans can lose knowledge whenever somebody is separated, injured, frightened, or unable to communicate. The infected increasingly do not have that weakness. Their numbers strengthen the speed at which the collective can process and adapt, an idea repeatedly emphasized in descriptions of Yeon and co-writer Choi Yoo-suk's conception of the creatures. So while the survivors struggle to become a functioning group, the enemy is becoming one almost automatically. This is why the film's character conflicts, even when broadly written, serve the central idea. Every disagreement costs time. Every private agenda creates friction. Every decision to protect one person rather than the group creates another calculation. Hyun-seok's relationship with his sister Hyun-hee gives this conflict a particularly human shape. He cannot approach survival as an abstract equation because somebody he loves cannot simply be treated as expendable weak. Official character descriptions identify him. He as his older sister, whose lower body disability changes the practical challenges of their escape. And I think the film is strongest when it understands what that means emotionally. Efficiency is not the same thing as humanity. The colony can optimize. People hesitate because people love. From a purely mechanical perspective, attachment creates weakness. It slows movement, it complicates decisions. It makes people risk themselves for outcomes that do not maximize their own chances. But Colony gradually asks whether those inefficiencies might be precisely what separate human intelligence from the intelligence spreading through the building. A collective can calculate, a person can care irrationally. That difference becomes increasingly important. Se-jeong provides another version of the same idea. He is connected to Se-jeong through a relationship that already carries history before the crisis begins. The film does not need to stop for enormous speeches about that history. Pressure reveals it through choices. In an emergency, old emotional distances suddenly become practical questions. Who do you follow? Who do you trust? And whose safety changes what you are willing to risk? Yeon keeps pushing these people physically upward, downward, across floors and through temporary shelters, but the emotional movement goes in the opposite direction. The building becomes smaller. Not literally, emotionally. At first, everyone inhabits separate lives. Then survival forces their circles of concern to overlap. The infected meanwhile spread physically outward while becoming mentally more unified. Humanity contracts toward relationships. The colony expands toward one consciousness. That opposition is why the film's pacing makes sense to me even when it occasionally sacrifices character depth for momentum. This is a story designed around escalation through adaptation. If the film stopped too frequently to explain every emotional history, it would break the sensation that both sides are learning under pressure. Yeon keeps the survivors moving because motion itself is part of the experiment. Can they communicate quickly enough? Can they improvise faster than the infected can learn? Can they turn individual strengths into collective survival without becoming emotionally interchangeable? The answer keeps changing. And then the film introduces another visual transformation. The infected do not merely become more coordinated in their behavior. The environment itself begins showing signs that the outbreak is producing something larger than a collection of diseased individuals. Reviewers observed a pale organic substance spreading through parts of the interior as the colony develops, visually suggesting that the building itself is being incorporated into the biological system. This is where the film's architecture changes meaning again. Earlier, the building divided bodies. Now the infection begins connecting space. The clean corporate surfaces that once represented controlled human organizations start carrying evidence of another organizing principle. Something is building itself inside the building, and that image is wonderfully simple. Humanity creates skyscrapers by dividing space into offices, floors, corridors, access points, and ownership. The colony begins erasing those divisions. It does not care whose office this was. It does not care which department belongs on which floor. It does not care about professional hierarchy. It turns separated territory into connected tissue. The film's title begins to feel less metaphorical. This is no longer simply a crowd of infected people trapped with survivors. A new social body is forming, and the humans begin realizing that escape cannot depend upon repeating whatever worked 5 minutes ago. So they improvise, they exploit what they understand. They combine scientific observation with physical courage, technical knowledge, sacrifice, and luck. Their greatest advantage is not strength, it is difference. One person notices what another misses. One person can perform something another cannot. One relationship motivates a decision no rational system would predict. The human group begins becoming effective not because everyone becomes identical, but because everyone remains distinct. And that, for me, is the story beneath the story. Konani places two forms of collective survival against each other. One achieves unity by dissolving individuality. The other must discover cooperation without surrendering individuality. That is much more interesting than simply asking whether the survivors can reach the next room. It also makes the action feel different as the film progresses. Early sequences are about fleeing from physical danger. Later sequences become contests of inference. What does the colony know now? What have the survivors accidentally taught it? What can still surprise something that shares experience across multiple bodies? A creature that fails is frightening. A system that understands why it failed is worse. And once the survivors begin grasping the scale of that problem, even their successes acquire a strangely temporary quality. You cannot relax after outsmarting these infected. You have to wonder whether outsmarting them was the mistake. This is where Colony earns much of its 8 out of 10 for me. Not because every turn is equally subtle, and not because every human being receives enough space to become as complicated as the concept deserves. Those limitations are real, and we will get to them, but the central mechanism keeps generating new dramatic consequences. The motif evolves naturally. Movement becomes coordination. Coordination becomes memory. Memory becomes adaptation. Adaptation becomes a kind of intelligence. And intelligence begins raising a question much more disturbing than whether the people inside Dunguri Building can escape. If the colony can learn from every confrontation, then eventually the survivors are not fighting a monster. They are fighting everything the monster has learned about them. The film has spent this entire stretch teaching us to recognize that shift. And just when the survivors begin to understand the true nature of this system surrounding them, another piece of information changes the moral and biological equation. The person everyone would rather treat simply as the cause of the disaster becomes impossible to dismiss so easily. The path out of the building, the nature of the infection, and the reason certain lives suddenly matter more than others begin collapsing into the same problem. And here is where the film shifts completely. Once you know how Colony was shaped behind the camera, its relentless forward motion begins to look less like an accident and more like the governing principle of the entire production. Yeon Sang-ho has said that the first version of the screenplay ran to roughly 168 pages, large enough that he estimated the material could have produced a film lasting around 3.5 hours. During development, he and the producers stripped that draft down to roughly 100 pages. Character history disappeared with it, including material that would have explained more of Young-cheol's connection to Se-jeong. Yeon's priority was clear. He wanted the finished film to pull the audience forward rather than repeatedly stop to explain where everyone came from. That decision explains both one of Colony's strengths and one of its weaknesses. The film moves because the screenplay has been engineered to move. Characters frequently arrive already carrying relationships instead of receiving lengthy introductory scenes. Se-jeong and Gyu-seong have history. Hyun-seok and Hyun-hee have an immediate familial bond. Other survivors enter with interpersonal tensions that we are expected to understand through behavior rather than biography. Yeon-seok deliberately leaned on distinctive relationships after realizing the faster structure would not allow extensive backstory. And suddenly, those slightly abbreviated characterizations make more sense. This is not necessarily an excuse when someone feels underwritten. A missing emotional layer is still missing, but it reveals the trade Yeon was making. He exchanged psychological accumulation for momentum. That trade is visible in the editing rhythm of almost every escape. There is rarely enough time to recover completely. Information arrives while bodies are moving. Emotional reactions are compressed into looks, hesitations, arguments, and decisions because the screenplay itself has been compressed around action. The film was conceived almost like an extreme escape room experience. The infected evolve while the humans survive by communicating and adjusting their roles. Yeon has described that game-like structure as a fundamental contrast between the two sides. So when a corridor suddenly demands a different solution, that is not simply action design. It is screenplay design becoming physical. The second production choice that matters is Ji-hyun. Her appearance in Colony marked her return to feature films after roughly 11 years. She has said that the screenplay and Yeon himself were central reasons she chose the project, particularly because she had been interested in the proactive women in his earlier work. But what she did not want Se-jeong to become may be even more revealing. Yoon explained that she deliberately resisted making Se-jeong suddenly perform extravagant action simply because the movie becomes dangerous. Her reasoning was grounded in character. Se-jeong is a biotechnology professor, not somebody whose profession would logically transform her into an unstoppable fighter the moment infected bodies appear. She wanted the character's physical behavior to remain within what Se-jeong could plausibly manage. That restraint helps the movie enormously. Watch how much of Se-jeong's authority comes from attention rather than force. She studies, she connects information, she communicates. She remains valuable because her mind operates differently from the threats surrounding her. If Yeon had transformed her into a conventional action superhero, the film would have weakened its own central opposition. The colony survives through increasingly synchronized physical capability, which won't survive through individual interpretation. Her difference is the point. Then there are the infected themselves. According to Korean production reporting, Yeon placed unusual emphasis on developing a physical language that would distinguish these creatures from his earlier zombies. Choreographer Ji-hyun, who had previously worked on Yeon's Train to Busan and Peninsula, collaborated with contemporary dancers and additional choreographers, repeatedly rehearsing different movement possibilities for individual sequences. That fact changes the way I see some of the film's most unsettling images. The infected look computer generated even when the disturbing element is simply a human body performing movement our eyes do not expect from it. That is important. Digital effects can create impossible anatomy, but choreography can create something psychologically stranger, a recognizable human shape moving according to an unfamiliar rule. A shoulder begins the motion before the head. Several bodies answer one rhythm. A creature crosses space with something closer to dance than ordinary pursuit. And because real performers are generating so much of that physical vocabulary, the synchronization has weight. Feet touch the floor, bodies occupy actual distance. Momentum has consequence. This is where the production method and the film's theme become almost perfectly aligned. Yeon needed creatures that could communicate the idea of collective intelligence before anyone explained it scientifically. Choreography provides the solution. You can see the colony's thinking because you can see its rhythm changing. One body becomes many, many bodies become one pattern, and that pattern becomes intelligence. What I appreciate most is that none of these production choices exist only as trivia. The shorter screenplay gives the film velocity. Jam's restrained performance keeps Se-jeong human. The momentum turns abstract collective intelligence into something visible. Three decisions made at completely different levels of production also have the same sensation. Colony wants us to feel adaptation happening before we have time to comfortably name it. That is why its best sequences seem to accelerate and organize simultaneously. The film is chaotic at the surface, but underneath that chaos is extremely deliberate construction. And now that we understand something about how that construction was achieved, we can look more closely at where all of those choices actually succeed. Because technique matters only when it becomes experience. And in Colony, the strongest achievements happen when performance, writing, camera movement, sound, and those synchronized bodies suddenly begin speaking the same language. What Colony achieves best is not reinvention through complexity, it is reinvention through behavior. The film takes something you already recognize, infected bodies pursuing frightened survivors through enclosed space, and changes the rhythm until the familiar image starts producing a different kind of anxiety. That achievement depends on several departments working toward exactly the same idea. The performances cannot behave as though they belong to a solemn character drama, while the camera behaves like an amusement ride. The infected cannot simply look unusual while moving like every other modern zombie. The sound cannot merely announce danger. Everything has to participate in the film's obsession with adaptation. And ji-hyun understands that immediately. Her Se-jeong is valuable because Jun rarely performs intelligence as superiority. She does not spend the movie looking like the only sensible person surrounded by fools. She looks like somebody thinking while frightened. There is a difference. When the infected begin revealing barrier patterns, watch what happens to her attention. She does not become emotionally empty. She becomes concentrated. Her face often seems to narrow around a problem in front of her. Fear remains present, but another process starts operating beneath it: comparison. What happened before? What is happening now? What changed? June herself described as lean and character-driven, and Se-jeong's established background in biotechnology and research on superorganisms makes her ability to identify patterns central to the survivor's response. The scene that proves the performance for me is not one of her largest physical moments. It is one of those points when the infected stop behaving like uncontrolled attackers, and their collective pause forces Se-jeong to reconsider what everyone believes they understand. Other people naturally experience the moment as terror. She experiences terror and evidence at once. That dual response gives June something much more interesting to play than conventional bravery. Se-jeong does not conquer fear. She keeps thinking inside it, and that quality fits the film beautifully because Colony is fundamentally suspicious of automatic reaction. The infected become dangerous because reaction becomes shared knowledge. Human survival depends on preserving the capacity to interpret something individually before the group decides how to respond. June becomes the still point inside that process. Then Seoul brings almost the opposite energy. His Young-cheol is disruptive before the colony itself becomes fully legible. He carries the volatility of somebody whose relationship with a disaster is fundamentally different from that of the people simply trying to survive it. Ku's performance does not ask us to mistake that volatility for depth or excuse destructive choices. What it gives the film is unpredictability. And unpredictability is precious in a story about systems learning patterns. Ku can make a reaction feel slightly misaligned with the emotional temperature around him. There is an awkwardness, a strange looseness, sometimes an almost absurd quality in the way Young-cheol occupies a crisis that prevents him from becoming nothing more than a mechanical villain whose only purpose is to explain the outbreak. Even when you dislike him, you watch him. That matters because a character at the center of the outbreak could easily become a walking exposition device. Instead, Ko gives him enough peculiar human rhythm to remain difficult to reduce. Around them, Ji Chang-wook and Kim Shin-rok provide a more immediate emotional register through Hyun-seok and his sister Hyun-hee. Their relationship matters because it converts the film's abstract question about collective survival into something painfully simple. When efficiency tells you to move, love may tell you to stay. Hyun-seok is established as a building security worker trying to protect his sister during the outbreak, where Yoon-hee's mobility limitations affect the practical reality of their escape. That relationship does not need elaborate philosophical dialogue. Its meaning exists in pace. Other people can move faster, they may not. The colony values synchronized capability. Human beings keep allowing attachment to interrupt synchronization again and again. Colony finds its humanity in these inefficient seconds. The screenplay by Yeon Sang-ho and Choi Ji-seok is strongest when it lets those practical decisions carry thematic weight without stopping to underline them. The writing keeps introducing problems in which knowledge creates only temporary advantage. That structure means the movie can repeat the basic survival rhythm without repeating the exact dramatic question. A tactic works, the colony absorbs information, the conditions change. Now the same people lead a new idea. That is an elegant engine because action becomes character examination. Who panics when the rules change? Who observes? Who protects somebody? Who chooses self-preservation? Who can communicate a thought quickly enough for the others to use it? The screenplay may be deliberately lean, but at its best that leanness produces clarity rather than emptiness. And then there is Byun Bong-soon's cinematography. The skyscraper could easily have become visually monotonous, corridor, office, staircase, repeat. Instead, critics have specifically noted how the cinematography exploits the tower's shifting scale, moving between large spaces and claustrophobic ones. That variation is essential to the tension. In a narrow passage, the infected feel overwhelming because there is nowhere to move. In a broad interior, they become frightening for the opposite reason. Now there is too much space. You can see multiple bodies, you can see patterns forming, you can watch distance disappear. The visual language therefore changes with the colony itself. Early movement can feel fragmented and reactive. The camera follows instability, sometimes sharing the nervous physical energy of creatures moving close to the ground. Reviews have noted the way the camera weaves with that bodily movement rather than observing it only from a safe distance. Later, the more coordinated the infected become, the more disturbing wider compositions can feel, because now the horror is not one face coming toward you, it is geometry. Several bodies occupying space with one intention. This is where choreography becomes cinematography. If those performers were moving randomly, a wide shot would reduce fear. You would see the trick. Instead, seeing more can make the situation worse because additional bodies reveal additional organization. The colony becomes legible as a shape, and then sound completes the transformation. One of the smartest choices in Colony is its willingness to make noise and silence dependent on each other. Contemporary criticism has singled out the collaboration between the film's visual and sound departments, while other reviews have emphasized its alternation between violent sonic eruption and sudden quiet. That contrast matters more than constant volume ever could. When infected bodies are moving, sound gives them weight. Footfalls, impacts, breaths, surfaces, collective motion. The building suddenly feels physically occupied. But when the colony stops, the absence of expected noise becomes information. Silence means attention. Silence means processing. Silence means you should probably be more afraid than you were a moment ago. This film does something rare with the pause between action beats. It does not always use the pause to let us recover. Sometimes the pause is the threat, and because of that, the score does not need to continuously instruct us toward fear. The most disturbing rhythm is already embedded in the creatures themselves. Noise, stillness, recognition, adaptation, movement again. That pattern becomes almost musical. It is a film's real theme being played through bodies. This is why I can forgive some of Colony's broadness more easily than I would in a film with less formal conviction. The screenplay is not always equally rich, but the movie knows what its images are doing. Even critics who are less persuaded by its characters repeatedly highlighted the carefully choreographed action, physical performers, cinematography, and creature design as major strengths. There is genuine craft in making an abstract concept immediately readable without turning it into explanation. Collective intelligence could have remained dialogue. Instead, Yeon makes it posture. He makes it spacing, he makes it rhythm. He makes it silence, and most importantly, he makes it change. The first synchronized body movement does not mean exactly what the later one means. At first, synchronization tells us these creatures are connected, then it tells us they remember. Eventually, every pause carries the possibility that they are becoming something the humans have not prepared for yet. Image becomes rhythm, rhythm becomes intelligence, intelligence becomes fear. That progression is the film's clearest achievement. But there is another language operating beneath all of this, one that does not require frantic movement, explanation, or even sound. Because some of the moments where Colony communicates most effectively are the moments when almost nothing happens at all, when the camera waits, when a body becomes still, when an empty piece of space suddenly matters, when nobody says what everyone understands, and that quieter language deserves our full attention next. Silence in Colony is never truly empty. It has weight. After so much running, scraping, impact, breath, and collective motion, the sudden absence of noise changes the shape of a room. A corridor that seemed merely narrow a few seconds earlier becomes enormous because there is nothing audible telling us where the danger has gone. The camera does not need to show another infected body immediately. Sometimes the uncertainty itself is enough. That is where the film's quieter language begins. Yeon Sang-ho understands that a creature becomes less frightening if every appearance is announced at maximum volume. Fear needs contrast. More importantly, this particular story needs moments in which observation becomes possible. If everything remained frantic, neither Se-jeong nor we could recognize the behavioral changes taking place, so the poses have a double function. They create suspense and they create thought. When the infected stop moving together, the stillness does not resemble exhaustion. It resembles concentration. The bodies may remain physically separate, but the shared pause makes them appear more connected than when they are running. Movement tells us they are dangerous. Stillness tells us they may be learning. That distinction is one of the film's most elegant ideas. Think about the visual contradiction. A human being standing perfectly still usually appears more individual because we can study the face, posture, and small personal gestures. The infected become less individual when they stop. One freezes, another freezes, then another. Separate bodies begin obeying the same invisible rhythm. The absence of movement becomes evidence of connection. This transforms empty space as well. When characters hide behind a wall or wait beside a closed entrance, what we cannot see becomes as important as what we can. The film does not always need to fill the frame with threat. Instead, architecture becomes a container for possibility. Something could be beyond the door, something could be below, something could already have changed. And because the infected adapt, absence itself becomes unstable. The survivors cannot simply remember where danger was, they must imagine where intelligence might send it next. That makes waiting unusually active. You can see it in Se-jeong. Her stillness differs from paralysis. She listens, she watches. She holds back action until she has enough information to make a choice. That is almost the opposite of the colony's collective behavior. The infected appear to absorb information through connection. Se-jeong processes it internally. One intelligence becomes stronger by eliminating separation, the other depends upon the privacy of thought. The film never needs a speech explaining this difference. It is already visible in the rhythm of the bodies. There are also moments when characters simply look at one another because language would add very little. Survival films often become overloaded with explanation. Someone discovers a rule, announces the rule, repeats the rule, and then another character repeats it again before the action demonstrates it. Korani occasionally explains more than necessary, but its better moments trust recognition. A changed expression can tell us that somebody has understood the danger. A hesitation can reveal disagreement. A person refusing to leave another behind can communicate an entire moral position without turning that choice into philosophy. This is especially important in the relationship between Hyun-seok and Hyun-hee. Their bond becomes meaningful through practical space. Who moves fast? Who waits? Who adjusts their pace? Who looks backward when everyone else is looking toward escape? These are small gestures, but they are precisely why the film's argument about individuality becomes human rather than theoretical. The colony moves efficiently because individual preference has almost vanished. Human beings move inefficiently because somebody matters to somebody else. A pause made for another person may be dangerous. It may also be the most human gesture in the film. And notice how different that pause feels from the infected stillness. The colony stops because information is being absorbed. A person stops because another life has emotional value. Both interrupt movement, but their meanings could not be more different. That is what makes silence so useful here. Without dialogue forcing interpretation, similar images can carry opposing emotions. Stillness can mean calculation. Stillness can mean fear. Stillness can mean care. Stillness can mean that something has noticed you. The camera often allows us enough time to feel that ambiguity before action begins again. And when movement returns, it hits harder precisely because silence prepared it. This matters to the film's larger motif. At the beginning of our journey, synchronized movement represented the loss of individuality, then it became memory, then intelligence. Here, silence changes the motif again. The colony does not need to move in order to feel unified. Its connection has become deeper than visible motion. The frightening possibility is that the shared intelligence continues even when nothing appears to be happening, and that makes the quietest spaces in colony strangely alive. An empty corridor is not merely empty. A closed room is not merely safe. A motionless body is not merely motionless. Everything feels as though it may be waiting for the next piece of information. There is something almost biological about the film's use of absence. Human architecture traditionally tells us where things end. A wall separates this room from that one. A floor separates one level from another. A door establishes inside and outside. The colony gradually challenges those distinctions. Its physical presence and shared behavior suggests connection where architecture promised separation. So when the camera holds on empty space, the emptiness becomes suspicious. What exactly does our world protect if the intelligence on the other side is adapting? What does distance mean if information is shared? What does isolation mean inside a system becoming one organism? Cinema rarely needs to answer those questions aloud when an image can make us feel them. And that is where Colony is most confident, not when everything explodes into motion, but when it trusts us to watch, to listen, to notice that the absence of movement has become movement of another kind. Because eventually every silence ends, the infected begin moving again. The survivors make another decision. The building tightens around them, and the film returns to velocity. But by then, the pause has changed us. We no longer hear silence as relief. We hear it as possibility. That is a real cinematic achievement. It also makes the film's weaknesses easier to identify, because whenever Colony trusts image, rhythm, and restraint, it feels distinctive. Whenever it abandons that confidence and falls back on broader characterization of familiar genre shortcuts, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. And that is where we need to go next. The difficulty with Colony is that the film's most original creation is also the thing that exposes everything around it. The infected evolve, the human characters do not always receive the same opportunity. That imbalance is where my strongest criticism begins. Yeon Sang-ho has created a threat whose behavior keeps developing as the story moves forward. We watch the colony learn, adapt, reorganize, and surprise us. Every new ability changes our understanding of what these creatures can become. But some of the survivors remain comparatively fixed. We understand their function in the narrative before we fully understand them as people. That distinction matters. A character can be useful without being memorable. Several critics identified precisely this weakness. Screen Daily praised the film as propulsive entertainment while finding the overall experience comparatively forgettable. And IndieWire argued that Yeon's ideas about civilization and collective behavior were painted too broadly. I understand that response. The problem is not that Kolani lacks ideas. It may actually have too many ideas competing for too little emotional space. Artificial intelligence, individuality, group behavior, scientific ethics, corporate systems, personal responsibility. Survival versus compassion. The meaning of collective intelligence, all of those elements are present, but presence is not depth. The film occasionally introduces a potentially rich emotional or philosophical tension, lets us recognize it, and then moves on because another physical crisis is already arriving. That is the cost of the velocity we discussed earlier. Remember that Yeon deliberately compressed a much longer screenplay to create this faster experience. That decision gives Colony its forward drive, but you can feel the missing material around certain relationships. Sometimes a character behaves in a way that makes perfect narrative sense while still leaving you wanting one more emotional beat, one more hesitation, one more quiet exchange, one more moment where the person exists without immediately serving the survival mechanism. This is especially noticeable because the movie proves elsewhere that it understands the power of stillness. When the infected become quiet, Yeon lets us study them. I occasionally wished he gave his humans the same privilege. There is also an unevenness in tone. Colony can move from disturbing biological horror into raw action and dark comedy with considerable confidence, but not every transition carries the same emotional weight. Some of the increasingly outrageous manifestations of the outbreak are entertaining precisely because they push the premise toward absurdity. Yet that escalation can weaken the atmosphere the film established when the colony first felt mysterious. The more possibilities the film reveals, the less frightening uncertainty sometimes becomes. Early on, a synchronized pause is terrifying because we do not understand it. Later, spectacle inevitably replaces some of that mystery. This is not automatically a failure. Escalation is part of the contract of a movie like this, but I prefer Colony when it makes me lean toward the screen rather than when it simply gives me more to look at. Little White Lies similarly found the hive-mind concept appealing while concluding that the film ultimately misses the mark, and the playlist described the result as uneven despite flashes of invention. For me, uneven is more accurate than unsuccessful. Because even when the storytelling becomes broad, the filmmaking rarely becomes lazy. That is an important distinction. I can criticize an emotional shortcut while still appreciating the choreography carrying us through it. I can wish a supporting character had been given greater depth while still admiring the precision with which the surrounding action is constructed. I can feel that the film's commentary on collective intelligence sometimes remains closer to metaphor than profound investigation, while still believing that the metaphor itself is unusually cinematic. And that is why these flaws do not destroy the movie for me. They become limits rather than wounds. The biggest missed opportunity is ultimately contained inside the film's central theme. If Colony is genuinely interested in individuality, then individuality should be something we feel more strongly in every important human being. The colony is frightening because distinctions disappear inside it. For that idea to reach maximum emotional force, the people opposing it should feel radically distinct. Different inner lives, different ways of speaking, different contradictions, different fears that cannot simply be reduced to survival. Some characters achieve that more effectively than others. Se-jeong has intellectual identity. Young-cheol has volatility. Hyun-seok's attachment to Hyun-hee gives him an emotional access. But the ensemble as a whole does not always become as textured as the organism surrounding it. Think about the irony. The film wants us to fear human beings becoming interchangeable, yet occasionally its supporting characters themselves begin feeling interchangeable within the machinery of the screenplay. That is the point where theme and execution briefly work against each other. And still, I would rather watch an ambitious genre film fail to completely explore a strong idea than watch a perfectly competent one with nothing underneath its surface. Colony reaches sometimes farther than its characterization can support, sometimes farther than its satire can follow, sometimes farther than its emotional relationships have been developed enough to justify. But it reaches that matters. My 8 out of 10 lies inside that contradiction. This is not a film I admire because every element is equally accomplished. I admire it because the strongest elements are distinctive enough to survive the weaker ones. The choreography survives. The evolving rhythm survives. The idea of intelligence moving from individual bodies into a shared system survives. And perhaps the most interesting thing about criticizing Colony is realizing that its shortcomings point directly toward what the movie is genuinely trying to understand. Because beneath all the infected bodies, sealed doors, scientific explanations, and increasingly complicated escape routes, there is one question that has been quietly growing since the beginning. If becoming part of something larger makes us stronger, what part of ourselves are we willing to lose in exchange? That is where the film becomes more interesting than its flaws, and that is where we go next. At the center of Colony is a frightening proposition. What if becoming more intelligent does not necessarily mean becoming more human? We tend to connect intelligence with individuality. A mind belongs to someone. Thought appears private before it becomes communication. Your memories, fears, contradictions, preferences, and mistakes help create the sensation that there is a specific person inside your body who cannot be completely replaced by anyone else. Colony begins pulling those assumptions apart. Its infected become more capable precisely because individual experience no longer remains individual. One learns or benefit. One discovers a weakness. The collective adjusts. From the perspective of survival, this is extraordinary. From the perspective of personhood, it is horrifying. Yeon Sang-ho has directly connected the film's conception to his thinking about artificial intelligence. He has said that considering AI as an accumulation of generalized human thinking led him toward the opposite concept, individuality. Official Korean cultural coverage similarly describes the film's evolving zombies as a way for Yeon to question individuality in an age of AI and collective intelligence. That does not mean Colony is simply an anti-AI movie. I think that reading would make it smaller than it is. AI provides the contemporary doorway. The deeper room is conformity. Because the uncomfortable thing about the colony is not that it becomes mindless, it becomes effective. That distinction changes everything. If the infected were merely reduced to instinct, individuality would obviously seem superior. We could look at the colony and say they have lost themselves and received nothing except hunger. But Young gives them something in return: efficiency, coordination, rapid learning, shared knowledge, adaptation. Their loss contains an advantage, and suddenly the question becomes difficult. What if surrendering part of the self genuinely made the group stronger? How much would we surrender? The film never needs to place that question on a screen because it is already expressed through movement. When several infected respond as one, there is something terrible about desynchronization, but there is also something almost beautiful in its precision. Nobody argues, nobody misunderstands, nobody refuses the plan because of pride, nobody conceals useful information, nobody has to persuade another body to cooperate. The colony simply acts. Human beings cannot do that. And Gordy quietly suggests that our inability to do it may be both our weakness and our value. Think about the surveyors. Their group is messy almost by definition. Knowledge is unevenly distributed. Physical ability differs. Relationships distort decisions. People carry guilt. People mistrust one another. Somebody knows something and fails to communicate it properly. Somebody cares about one person more than the survival mathematics would justify. From the colony's perspective, this is terrible design. From the film's perspective, it may be the entire point, because individuality is inefficient, love is inefficient, grief is inefficient, forgiveness is inefficient, even morality is frequently inefficient. If efficiency means maximizing immediate survival, the colony does not have to ask whether abandoning one member feels wrong. Humans too. That question costs them time, but perhaps the fact that they ask it is what makes their survival worth protecting. Here is what I keep returning to. The film does not really oppose the individual and the group. It opposes two different ways of becoming a group. The infected create unity by eliminating difference. The humans have to discover unity while preserving difference. That is much harder and much more fragile. Yeon has spoken about collective intelligence, evolution, and the potential harm created by those processes when they become detached from individuality. In another interview, he described contemporary AI debates as central to the film's conceptual background. What makes Colony interesting is that it refuses to keep that idea abstract. The skyscraper becomes its physical metaphor. At the beginning, the building is organized through division, floors, rooms, doors, departments, security zones, individual spaces arranged into a larger structure. That is one model of society. Separate units cooperating because architecture provides boundaries and connections at the same time. Then the infection begins, creating a different model. The spreading organic presence does not respect those boundaries. The distinction between one body and another weakens. The distinction between individual experience and shared experience weakens. Separation itself becomes something the colony is evolving beyond. So the horror is not merely biological contamination. It is the collapse of borders around the self. That is why the recurring pauses become so meaningful. Earlier, we interpreted the colony's stillness as processing. Here, I think it represents something even larger: consensus without conversation. Imagine human beings achieving perfect agreement instantly. No debate, no misunderstanding, no uncertainty about what everyone else knows. At first, that sounds almost utopian. Then ask what must disappear for such perfect agreement to exist. Private thought, dissent, misinterpretation, contradiction, the right to be wrong alone, the right to change your mind before anybody else does, the right to know something that the group does not, the right to remain separate. Suddenly, perfect synchronization begins looking like another kind of death. And this is where Colony's AI inspiration becomes emotionally useful rather than merely topical. The film is not asking whether technology is evil, it is asking what happens when generalization becomes more valuable than specificity. AI systems are built through patterns across enormous bodies of information. Young's metaphor takes that cultural anxiety and turns it into infected bodies sharing accumulated experience. He told ABC that his concerns centered on AI potentially reducing individuality, while also discussing how society increasingly rewards generalized forms of thought. But human beings are often most meaningful where they resist generalization. There is no statistical average that fully explains why one specific person matters to another specific person. That is why Hyun-seok and Hyun-hee matter dramatically even when their categorization remains relatively simple. To an optimizing system, a person whose slows escape is a problem. To a brother, she is his sister. No further equation can replace that fact. That is individuality expressed through relationship. Se-jeong provides another version. Her value does not come from possessing the same knowledge as everyone else. It comes from seeing differently. The colony becomes powerful by sharing perception. Se-jeong becomes useful because her perception remains distinct. She can look at behavior everyone has witnessed and recognize a meaning others have missed. Difference creates survival, and Young-cheol complicates the idea even further. Because individuality is not automatically virtuous, a person can be selfish individually, cruel individually, wrong individually, dangerous individually. The film does not romanticize separateness as though every private impulse deserves protection. What matters is the capacity for choice. The colony removes the burden of choosing differently. Humans retain it. And with choice comes responsibility. That is why the movie ultimately feels less interested in whether people should cooperate than in how cooperation should work. Healthy collective life does not require everyone becoming identical. It requires different people finding reasons to act together. That distinction sounds simple. Living it is not. Every family knows this. Every friendship knows this. Every society knows this. You want connection without disappearance. You want belonging without having to erase the part of yourself that does not perfectly fit. You want other people to understand you without becoming you. And perhaps that is the emotional truth hidden beneath early biotechnology. To be human is to live permanently between two desires. We want to belong and we want to remain ourselves. Too much isolation becomes loneliness. Too much conformity becomes erasure. Colony turns that tension into horror by imagining a life form that has solved the problem completely. There is no loneliness inside the colony because there is barely an individual left to experience loneliness. Everybody belongs, completely, and that completeness is terrifying. The synchronized movement we began with has therefore changed meaning again. It first looked like coordination, then memory, then intelligence. Now it becomes belonging without identity. That is the destination of the motive, not simply many bodies moving together, many bodies for whom together may be the only remaining state. And when the film places that image against frightened, argumentative, imperfect people still trying to protect each other, I know which side I want to remain on. Not because humanity is more efficient. It clearly is not, but because the friction between us contains something the colony cannot reproduce, a choice that belongs to one person, a thought nobody else has yet, a refusal, a sacrifice, a mistake, a relationship that makes no strategic sense, a self. That is what colony is really protecting beneath the survival spectacle, not merely human bodies. The space between them. Yeon Sang-ho keeps returning to the same dramatic situation in different forms. A system appears. People believe they understand how that system works, then pressure exposes what the system was really built to protect. In Train to Busan, that system is partly the train itself. Compartments, destinations, doors, social divisions, and passengers forced into proximity while individual self-interest collides with collective survival. Yeon later described the train and its fixed destination as carrying much of that film's metaphorical weight, where the zombies themselves remained comparatively fictional. With Colony, he deliberately shifts the metaphor into the infected bodies. That feels like a continuation of his filmmaking rather than a repetition of it. Yeon has never seemed especially interested in monsters as isolated objects. He is interested in what monsters reveal about groups. When Hellbound introduces impossible supernatural judgments, the question quickly becomes what institutions, religious movements, frightened individuals, and opportunists towards uncertainty enters society. Yeon explained that the project evolved from an early fascination with individual fear toward a larger question about how society itself would react if something incomprehensible actually happened. That instinct is everywhere in Colony. The biological event matters, but the response to it matters just as much. Who believes whom? Who follows authority? Who protects another person? Who treats survival as mathematics? Who turns information into power? The supernatural or biological threat becomes a stress test for ordinary human organization. That may be the clearest signature running through Yeon's work. He builds extraordinary situations in order to watch very ordinary weaknesses become visible. Self-interest, fear, hierarchy, belief, conformity. The need to belong, the instinct to control. Even Revelations, a very different kind of story, was framed by Yeon around selective belief and the way people construct certainty from what they want to accept. Korean Film Council coverage described the film within Yeon's continuing interest in complex social questions. Korean takes that obsession and makes it physical. Instead of people forming ideological groups around fear, the infected literally become a group mind. The metaphor no longer sits around the monster. The monster becomes the metaphor, and visually, that produces one of the most revealing differences between Colony and Train to Busan. The train forces separate people into a narrow line. Movement is directional, forward or backward. Truth is carriage or the next. The architecture determines the rhythm. Kolani's tower is more vertical and fragmented. Survivors occupy different rooms, levels, and routes, while the infected increasingly behave as if separation matters less and less. The architecture divides, the colony connects. That opposition feels unmistakably Yeon because space in his genre filmmaking is rarely neutral. A location becomes a social machine. Put people inside it, apply pressure, watch the hidden rules emerge. But Colony is also a departure. Its fascination with AI era generalization and shared intelligence makes the threat less purely social than some of Yeon's previous metaphors. Yeon has said that contemporary artificial intelligence helped lead him toward questions about universalized thought and the erosion of individuality. So here, the danger is not only what frightened humans do to one another. The danger is a competing model of intelligence that pushes Yeon toward something almost philosophical. What is intelligence without individuality? What is cooperation without choice? What is a community if its members no longer possess meaningful separation? The answers remain embedded in action because Yeon is still fundamentally a filmmaker who likes ideas to move. He rarely leaves the concept sitting at a table. He puts it in a corridor. He gives it a door that will not stay secure. He gives it several frightened people who disagree about what to do. Then he removes the time they would need to discuss the problem comfortably. That is his storytelling instinct at its most recognizable. Thought under pressure, ethics under pressure, relationships under pressure, society miniaturized until everything becomes immediate. And that is why Colony fits his body of work even when its creatures behave differently from anything he has used before. Yeon keeps asking how people remain human when systems encourage them not to. Sometimes the system is economic, sometimes institutional, sometimes religious. Here it becomes biological, but the recurring concern remains recognizable. The individual is always standing inside something larger. The larger thing always promises some form of order, and Yeon is always suspicious of what that order might demand in return. I would not call Colony the definitive peak of his filmmaking. The emotional force of Train to Busan remains difficult to match because its social metaphor and its intimate relationships reinforce each other with exceptional simplicity. But Colony may be one of the clearest expressions of Yeon's conceptual instinct. It tells us that he does not return to zombies because zombies themselves are endlessly fascinating. He returns because the genres him turn invisible social pressures into bodies you can see, and here those bodies finally become the system itself. They move together, they learn together, they surrender difference together, which leaves the humans with the harder task Yeon's films keep returning to. How do you belong to other people without disappearing inside them? That question connects Colony backward through his work, but knowing where one comes from also changes the way we look forward to this particular film. because once you know what the colony eventually becomes, those early movements no longer look innocent. The pauses mean more. The mistakes mean more. Even the first moments of apparent chaos begin revealing patterns that were always there. And that is why Colony becomes a slightly different film when you return to it. The first time through Colony, you watch the infected because they are coming towards someone. The second time, you watch them because you know they are communicating. That single change reorganizes the film. What initially resembles disorder begins looking much more deliberate. A body turning at the edge of the frame matters. A cluster stopping almost simultaneously matters. The direction of attention matters. Even an unsuccessful attack matters because you now understand that failure is not necessarily wasted inside this biological system. The larger organism may be collecting information from it. And suddenly, the earliest outbreak scenes feel less chaotic than they did before. On the first viewing, speed dominates perception. People are running. The building is being sealed. Characters have incomplete information. The infected seem to erupt into spaces with such physical intensity that simply following the immediate danger consumes most of your attention. On a rewatch, that urgency remains, but curiosity begins competing with it. Instead of asking only where will they attack, you begin asking, what have they already learned? That question changes everything. Look again at the moments when light influences infected behavior. What initially registers as another useful monster rule begins feeling temporary almost as soon as you understand the larger design. Reviews of the film repeatedly note the infected response to visual stimuli and the way their collective behavior evolves as the outbreak continues. The first time, discovering a behavioral weakness feels reassuring. The second time, it feels like a countdown. Because now you know that Polony is not interested in giving its survivors permanent roles. It gives them temporary knowledge. That distinction creates a strange retrospective suspense. You already know approximately where the story is going. Yet, individual solutions become more fragile because you can see how confidently the humans misunderstand the permanence of their own discoveries. A tactic is not a solution, it is a demonstration. And the colony is watching. The synchronized pauses become even more revealing. On a first viewing, they are uncanny because they interrupt the expected rhythm of zombie behavior. These creatures have been defined by velocity, so collective stillness feels fundamentally wrong. On a second viewing, the silence has structure. You recognize it as a transition between versions of the threat. Before the pause, the infected possess one set of behavioral possibilities. After it, something may have changed. That makes every still body feel almost like part of a biological computer processing an update, not literally, visually. And once you understand that image, you begin noticing how carefully Yeon Sang-ho alternates between individual infected bodies and the larger group. Sometimes the camera gives you one creature, sometimes several, sometimes enough bodies appear together that you stop reading faces completely and begin reading formations. That visual progression mirrors the idea of the fin. The individual disappears, the pattern remains. There is also a human detail that becomes more important on rewatch. Who notices what? Se-jeong's intelligence is clearer the second time because you are no longer waiting for the rules to be revealed alongside her. Now you can study the process by which she reaches them. The difference between observation and panic becomes sharper. Someone sees movement. She sees changed movement. Someone sees an infected body behaving strangely. She begins comparing that behavior against what happened earlier. On first viewing, those moments carry plot information. On rewatch, they carry characterization. Se-jeong becomes less important because she knows scientific facts and more important because she knows how to revise an assumption. That is exactly the skill the colony forces humans to develop. The film's interpersonal choices also gain a different weight. When Hyun-seok slews himself for Hyun-hee, or when one character risks efficiency because of attachment, those decisions initially register as ordinary survival drama emotion. After you understand where the film's idea of collective intelligence is heading, they become ideological without becoming speeches. These people remain inefficient because they remain specific to one another. One person is not simply a member of the group, she is somebody's sister, another is somebody's former partner, another carries knowledge nobody else possesses. The human group functions through asymmetry, the colony functions by reducing it, and the rewatch makes that contrast much easier to see. Even Young-cheol reads differently once you understand more about the relationship between the outbreak, the collective, and the intentions surrounding its creation. I am deliberately stopping short of the deepest explanation here because the next movement belongs to full spoilers, but a second viewing makes several of his early reactions feel less like eccentric behavior and more like evidence whose importance was hidden by our lack of context. RogerEbert.com's review similarly identifies his unusual relationship with the hive intelligence as a major element of the film's later mechanics. That is the best kind of rewatch detail, not a secret object circled in the background, a behavior whose meaning changes. The image has not changed, you have, and that is ultimately why Colony gains something on a second viewing, despite losing the surprise of its evolving zombie rules. The first experience is discovery. The second is pattern recognition. You start seeing the movie the way Se-jeong does. You compare, you connect, you notice that what looked like random violence was sometimes information exchange. You notice that apparent safety often depended on rules already becoming obsolete. You notice that the film had been preparing the distinction between human cooperation and hive coordination long before it fully explained that distinction. Most importantly, the opening image of many bodies moving together stops functioning merely as horror. It becomes the destination the entire outbreak is moving toward. On first viewing, you fear what the infected might become. On the second, you watch them becoming it. And now there is no reason to remain outside the final layer. Because once we cross the next line, hints become answers, behavior becomes mechanism, the strange relationship at the heart of the colony becomes explicit, and the ending finally reveals whether a perfectly connected intelligence is actually as perfect as it appears. Every zombie film inherits a crowd. Long before Corning gave that crowd a shared intelligence, filmmakers had already discovered that the zombie was uniquely capable of turning social anxiety into physical movement. One body can be a monster. Hundreds of nearly identical bodies become something else entirely. A population, a system, a reflection. And for Yeon Sang-ho, one point in that history matters explicitly: George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead. Yeon has identified Romero's film as a reference for his understanding of zombies, explaining that he sees them as embodiments of dangers lying dormant inside the society surrounding us. For a colony, he asked what the equivalent torment danger might be now, eventually connecting it to artificial intelligence, group mentality, and the pressure towards social uniformity. That connection gives us a much clearer way to place colony inside zombie history. Romero looked at the crowd and recognized society. Yeon looks at the crowd and asks what happens when society begins thinking as a crowd. That is not a rejection of the older tradition. It is an update. The mall in Dawn of the Dead remains one of zombie cinema's defining spaces because the infected return almost mechanically to an environment associated with consumption. The horror comes partly from recognition. Even after ordinary consciousness disappears, patterns created by society seem to remain. Yeon carries that principle forward. His infected also embody a contemporary pattern. But repetition is no longer enough. They learn, they exchange information, they evolve. The zombie crowd has moved from habit to cognition. And that difference may be the single most important thing Kolemi contributes to the conversation. The traditional zombie is terrifying because it cannot be reasoned with. The colony becomes terrifying because it can improve. That is a fundamentally different anxiety. It also tells us how much the world around zombie cinema has changed. A monster built around repetition made perfect sense for fears about consumer conformity. A monster built around collective learning makes perfect sense for a culture increasingly fascinated and unsettled by networks that improve through accumulated information. The body remains familiar. The metaphor evolves. Yeon himself describes that as part of the genre's continuing possibility. He has argued that zombie cinema still has room to develop beyond simple survival scenarios and has expressed interest in questions about whether infected people retain some claim to humanity, what responsibility society might have toward them, and what reintegration could mean if infection were reversible. That curiosity separates him from a filmmaker simply returning to a successful formula. And then there is Train to Busan. We cannot understand Colony without placing those two films beside each other, but the comparison becomes useful only when we stop asking which one is better. They are responding to different fears. Yeon has described Train to Busan as a story in which a protagonist deeply embedded in capitalist structures discovers how meaningless those assumptions become when the social system suddenly collapses. The horror was not simply infected passengers, it was watching familiar rules lose authority. That film placed extraordinary pressure on human relationships. A father and daughter became the emotional spine. Individual selfishness and collective responsibility collided repeatedly. Its zombies intensified the human conflict. Kolani reverses that balance. Yeon has contrasted the two directly, where Train to Busan leaned heavily on father-daughter drama. Konani was constructed around the more game-like mechanics of an extreme escape room, with about being infected on one side and communicating humans on the other. That explains why Colony feels colder even when it is more conceptually elaborate. The earlier film asks whether people can rediscover humanity during collapse. The newer film asks whether humanity itself still has an advantage when another form of collective existence may be more efficient. That is a fascinating progression. Yeon's own Seoul Station and Peninsula also form part of the path him here. Along with Train to Busan, they helped establish his sustained engagement with zombie cinema and contributed to the broader international visibility of Korean zombie filmmaking. Yeon himself has spoken proudly about the increased global expectations surrounding Korean zombie films after Train to Busan. But Colony does not simply make the zombies faster, larger, or more aggressive in order to justify returning. It changes their relationship to knowledge, that is, the inheritance being transformed. Zombie cinema has always understood that a crowd can erase identity. Colony asks something more uncomfortable. What if identity is precisely what prevents the crowd from reaching its maximum potential? What if individuality is not only something society threatens to erase, but an inefficiency that a more optimized form of life might actively discard? Tomorrow's crowd carries the memory of society. Young's Colony carries information, and information becomes evolution. That places Colony in conversation with the cinema before it without trapping the movie inside homage. It inherits the zombie as social metaphor. It inherits the enclosed survival space. It inherits the collapsing distinction between ordinary citizen and threatening mass. But then it adds one crucial modern fear. The crowd does not simply want your body. It may possess a better method of learning than you do. And once that possibility enters zombie cinema, an old monster acquires a new future. Which brings us exactly where the film has been pushing us all along. We have talked around the final transformation. We have protected the deepest reveal. We have examined the colony as image, rhythm, system, metaphor, and cinematic inheritance. Now there is nowhere left to hide from what actually happens. From this point forward, the ending matters. The mechanism matters, and every secret the film has been withholding is finally allowed into the room. From this moment, we go into full spoilers. If you have not yet seen this film, stop here, go experience it first, and come back. Some things deserve to be felt before they are understood. The deepest reveal in Colony is that Seoul, Young-cheol, is not simply the man who relieves the infection. He has built himself into its architecture. Young-cheol's research grows from an obsession with shared consciousness. His former boss Kang Woo-cheol takes credit for his work and removes him from the company, while Young-cheol also carries anger connected to Se-jeong's earlier involvement in the investigation of his father. He convinces himself that secrecy, misunderstanding, jealousy, and incomplete communication are not merely human problems but defects that can be engineered out of humanity. His answer is the colony, a form of existence in which thought can be shared instead of hidden. That makes his villainy more interesting than simple revenge. Young-ho does not want chaos. He wants perfect communication. The horror comes from what he is willing to erase in order to achieve it. Once he becomes connected to the infected, the strange behavior we have been watching acquires a new dimension. The infected communicate through the biological network spreading through the building, enter the rigid processing states when new information is absorbed, and gradually become capable of increasingly sophisticated responses. Young-cheol can perceive through that network and influence the colony, turning what initially looked like autonomous evolution into something partly directed. And this is where those earlier moments become much darker. When survivors believed they were hiding from individual creatures, they were sometimes hiding inside a system capable of sharing what one body discovered. When they spoke near an infected presence, information itself could become dangerous. When the creatures later imitate human behavior and even voices, the distinction between observation and infiltration almost disappears. The colony is no longer simply learning how humans move. It is learning how humans trust. That is a much more frightening threshold. A locked door only protects you if you know the voice asking you to open it belongs to a person. Once the system can imitate that reassurance, language itself becomes contaminated. And this brings us to one of the film's cruelest threads, Hyun-seok and Hyun-hee. Their relationship has represented human inefficiency throughout the story. He stays because she matters specifically to him. Her safety cannot be reduced to a calculation about the larger group. But the survivors themselves eventually fracture. Information is mishandled, self-preservation overwhelms cooperation. Hyun-hee is left vulnerable, and Young-cheol uses the colony's expanding reach against her. By the time Hyun-seok confronts what has happened, his grief turns toward rage, and the difference between justice, revenge, and desperation becomes almost impossible for him to separate. The confrontation ends with Young-cheol using the infected Hyun-hee against her own brother, and Hyun-seok dies in the very relationship he spent the film trying to protect. It is painful because the film converts its central idea into something intimate. Shared consciousness sounds abstract when Young-cheol describes it as progress. Here we see what it actually does. It takes one of the most private human bonds imaginable and empties it of consent. Hyun-hee's body can still be recognized by her brother, but recognition no longer guarantees that the person he loves controls what that body does. The colony has achieved connection by destroying relationship, and that difference matters. Inertium is not automatically intimacy. Knowing everything is not the same as understanding anyone. Meanwhile, outside the building, Kang Sol-lee has been working toward the same biological puzzle from another direction. After the crisis expands and the existing containment strategy begins collapsing, Seoul-hee and Se-jeong finally combine what each of them knows. The film has spent 2 hours telling us that the colony's advantage is shared information. Its human answer is not isolation. It is communication without surrender individuality. That is why the final solution is thematically smarter than simply producing a larger weapon. Se-jeong recognizes that the colony's strength contains a weakness. If every member follows information shared through the system, then incorrect information can become collective error. The film frames the solution through the image of an ant mill or death spiral, a loop in which following the same signal produces repetition instead of progress. Se-jeong uses the infected network's own targeting behavior against it, redirecting the colony until the synchronized intelligence that once seemed almost unbeatable becomes trapped inside its own certainty. And I love the irony of that. All film long individuality looked inefficient. Now uniformity becomes the weakness. One infected does not stop and say, something is wrong. One body does not refuse. One mind does not challenge the information passed through the group. The colony is brilliant at sharing knowledge. It is terrible at doubt. That may be the most important idea in the entire movie. Human beings complain about doubt because it slows us down. We question. We misunderstand. We argue. We interpret the same evidence differently. It is exhausting. But doubt also creates the possibility of correction. A perfectly synchronized system can move incredibly quickly in the wrong direction. And once the colony accepts the false target, synchronization becomes the trap, the body's circle. The pattern tightens. The intelligence that had spent the film accumulating human strategies begins collapsing under contaminated information. The motif we have followed since the opening finally turns against itself. Movement became coordination, coordination became memory, memory became intelligence, intelligence became conformity, and conformity becomes vulnerability. After the reset, the infected lose much of the accumulated knowledge that made them increasingly formidable. Earlier behavior limitations return, allowing Se-jeong to exploit a more primitive version of their perception. She uses that regression to draw them toward another forced representation of human presence and turn the colony's own automatic response against Young-cheol. Then comes the final reversal. Young-cheol wanted to create a form of humanity beyond misunderstanding, but the organism he created never truly guarantees his place within it. His control is imperfect. His communication is imperfect, and in the climax, the very system designed to eliminate miscommunication becomes something he cannot successfully redirect in time. The architect of the colony becomes trapped by the colony. His death, therefore, means more than the defeat of a villain. It proves the flaw in his dream. Young-cheol imagined that individuality was the source of human tragedy. The film suggests something more complicated. Miscommunication creates tragedy. But removing the individual does not create understanding, it creates obedience. Those are not the same thing. When Young-cheol dies, the connected infected become motionless, and authorities believe the remaining victims may effectively be brain dead. Se-jeong and Seoul-hee are left with the possibility of developing their own response to the infection, rather than depending upon Young-cheol as the supposed source of a cure. For a moment, the film appears ready to give us closure, but Colony has spent too much time teaching us that biological rules are temporary, so its final image refuses certainty. After Se-jeong leaves, one infected body moves, just movement. That is enough, because by now movement has acquired an entire vocabulary. At the beginning of this essay, bodies moving together represented the frightening birth of a collective. At the end, a single body moving becomes frightening for the opposite reason. The colony may no longer need the person who believed he controlled it. The system may have survived its creator. And perhaps evolution has already begun again. The film does not need an additional post-credit reveal. Reporting on the theatrical release indicates there is no mid-credit or post-credit scene. The warning is already embedded in the final moments before the credits. That choice is right. A larger tease would weaken it. One small movement leaves us with exactly the uncertainty this movie has earned. Not the monster is back. Something more interesting. The rules are changing again. And emotionally, that is where Colony lands for me. I do not think the ending has the devastating human force of Train to Busan. Some of the people we lose have not been developed deeply enough for every sacrifice to carry the weight it wants. The mechanics sometimes impress more than the emotion. But the final idea stays with me. Young-cheol believes perfect communication requires the disappearance of private boundaries. Se-jeong and Seoul-hee defeat him by doing something much more ordinary. They remain separate minds, they possess different pieces of information. They communicate, they listen. And because neither disappears into the other, they are capable of combining knowledge without surrendering judgment. That is the human alternative to the colony, not isolation, not perfect agreement, cooperation. The difference sounds small. The entire film exists inside it. A colony shares everything because its members no longer fully belong to themselves. Human beings share because they choose to, and perhaps that choice, fragile, inefficient, incomplete, sometimes disastrously misunderstood, is precisely what Young-cheol never understood. The perfect collective fails because nobody inside it can truly stand apart. The imperfect humans survive because somebody can. And when that final infected body moves, the question is no longer simply whether the outbreak is over. It is whether humanity will remember the lesson before the colony learns its next one. The moment I keep returning to is not the loudest one. It is that final movement, one infected body, after everything we have watched, refusing to let stillness become certainty. For most of colony, movement means danger, then movement becomes coordination, later it becomes intelligence, adaptation, and eventually something closer to collective identity. By the time the film reaches its ending, We have been trained to read even the smallest physical change as meaningful, so when something moves again, the reaction is almost instinctive. Not another chase, not another battle, just the realization that whatever these characters thought they had finished may already be beginning again. That image stayed with me because it captures what I like most about Korini. The film understands that uncertainty can be more powerful than explanation. For all its scientific language and evolving rules, it finally leaves us with something incredibly simple, a body that should not move, moving. And suddenly, the entire story feels unfinished in a productive way, not incomplete, unsettled. There is a difference. I do not leave Colony thinking primarily about the mechanics of its virus. I leave thinking about the strange comfort we take from believing that systems have endings. We identify a cause, we remove it, we create a solution. We expect the world to return to its previous shape, but complex things rarely behave so politely. Ideas outlive the people who introduce them. Technologies outlive the intentions of their creators. Institutions continue functioning long after the reason for their existence has changed. Patterns become independent, and the colony may have become exactly that, something larger than Young-cheol's ambition. That is why his defeat does not satisfy the way a conventional villain's defeat might. Removing him cannot remove everything that has already happened. The organism has learned, the humans have changed, the building has been transformed, people are gone, knowledge now exists that did not exist before. You cannot reset all of that simply because the person at the center of the disaster is no longer there. And maybe that is what that final movement represents to me. Consequences continuing after intention ends. There is also something unexpectedly sad beneath all of this. For a film filled with bodies becoming connected, Colony leaves me thinking about how difficult genuine connection actually is. Young-cheol's dream removes the problem by removing the distance between minds. No misunderstanding, no secrets, no private thought. But what would be left to call relationship if there were no distance to cross? Part of caring about another person is accepting that you cannot completely know them. You listen because you do not automatically possess their thoughts. You ask because you do not already have the answer. You trust because certainty is unavailable. Human connection exists partly because separation exists first. That idea is what gives the film's messier relationships more weight in retrospect. People misunderstand one another. They disappoint each other. They make selfish decisions. They protect somebody when doing so is inconvenient. They fail to communicate perfectly. And strangely, I would choose all of that over the colony's flawless transmission. Because perfect access is not intimacy, it is possession. That distinction is what I carry away from the film. I also carry some frustration. I wish several characters had been allowed more time to breathe. I wish certain losses hurt as much emotionally as they work conceptually. There are places where Colony reaches the correct idea before it has fully earned the feeling. That prevents it from becoming something truly exceptional for me, but I would return to it. And I think that matters. I would return because the physical language is distinctive enough that I suspect the early scenes become richer once you know what the infected are becoming. I would return because ji-hyun's Se-jeong gives the film a calm intellectual center without turning intelligence into coldness. I would return for those synchronized pauses, for the uncomfortable stillness, for the moment several bodies stop feeling like several bodies. And I would return because the film leaves behind a question that extends far beyond zombies. How much of yourself can you surrender before belonging becomes disappearance? There is no simple answer to that. Every meaningful relationship asks us to compromise something. Families do, friendships do, communities do, societies do. We cannot live completely alone, but we also cannot become fully interchangeable without losing something essential. Colony tapes that ordinary tension and exaggerates it until the difference becomes biological. That is why I think the people most likely to carry this film with them are not necessarily the biggest zombie fans. There are people who respond to genre movies when the genre becomes a vessel for another anxiety, people who enjoy noticing how physical rules become metaphors, people who are willing to forgive some emotional thinness because the central idea keeps unfolding after the spectacle has ended. And maybe people who have occasionally felt the pressure to think the same way everyone around them seems to think. Because beneath all the horror, there is something quietly reassuring in Colony's resistance to perfect synchronization. Being difficult to categorize may matter, changing your mind may matter, disagreeing may matter, being the one person who does not follow the circle may matter. The colony becomes powerful because everybody receives the same information. Humanity survives because somebody eventually sees the information differently. That is the thought that remains with me after everything else has gone quiet. Not the tower, not the outbreak, not even the final confrontation, just the value of one mind remaining separate enough to notice that everyone else is moving in the wrong direction. And perhaps that is why the last movement of The Infected feels so appropriate. The film refuses to let us become comfortable. It moves once more, and we are forced to think again. So where does that leave Colony? For me, it leaves behind a film that is easier to admire than to completely love, but one whose strongest ideas are vivid enough that I continue thinking about them after the machinery of the plot has stopped. This is not simply Yeon Sang-ho returning to zombies, because that is where his greatest international success began. It feels like him asking whether the zombie can still mutate as a cinematic metaphor, and the answer, at least here, is yes. The infected of Colony frighten me less because they run quickly than because they eventually stop behaving like separate creatures. Their shared intelligence transforms the oldest image in zombie cinema, the crowd, into something distinctly contemporary. A crowd that learns, a crowd that remembers, a crowd that becomes stronger as individuality disappears. That idea carries the film even when the characters do not always receive enough space to carry equal emotional weight, and that is the limitation I cannot ignore. There are relationships here I wanted to feel more deeply. There are losses whose thematic importance is greater than their emotional impact. There are moments when the screenplay races toward its next clever development before the human consequence of the previous one has fully settled. If you need your horror to be built first and foremost around intimate character depth, Colony may leave you wanting more. But if you enjoy cinema that uses movement, architecture, creature design, and action mechanics to think through a larger idea, there is a great deal here worth experiencing. It's best-selling because Ewan understands something crucial. The opposite of individuality is not necessarily stupidity. Sometimes it is efficiency, and that makes the threat much more uncomfortable. The colony offers perfect belonging at the cost of the person who belongs. The humans survive to something slower and less elegant. Difference, argument, attachment, doubt, communication between separate minds rather than the elimination of separation itself. That is why the film Mansa feels quietly hopeful, even while its last image refuses to let us feel completely safe. The colony can learn astonishingly quickly, but somebody who thinks differently can still break the pattern. For me, Colony earns an 8 out of 10 because its conceptual ambition, physical imagination, and evolving visual language remain stronger than the emotional shortcuts that keep it from becoming truly exceptional. If you concede theoretically, the scale, sound, and choreography deserve that environment. If that opportunity has passed, it is still an easy recommendation for a focused streaming watch, particularly for anyone interested in Yeon Sang-ho's continued evolution of the zombie genre. Would I personally need to own it? Probably not. But I would absolutely return to it, because now that I know where the colony is going, I want to watch the first body stop moving again. I want to watch the others follow, and I want to see exactly when a crowd stops being a crowd and becomes a mind. Maybe that is the final image Colony leaves behind. Not humanity standing against monsters, something smaller. One person standing slightly outside the pattern, watching everyone else move in the same direction, and realizing that survival might begin with refusing to follow. Thank you for spending this time with me here at the Cineflux. Films like Colony are exactly why I love returning to genre cinema. You can arrive expecting infected bodies, locked doors, desperate escapes, and all the familiar pleasures of survival horror. And somewhere inside that experience, you discover a question about something much more ordinary: belonging. Individuality, the fear of being alone, and the equally powerful fear of disappearing inside everyone else. If this journey gave you another way of seeing Colony, let me know where you landed with it. Did the hive mind idea genuinely push zombie cinema somewhere new for you, or did you still find yourself comparing everything to Train to Busan? Did the ending work for you? And if you had to choose, what disturbed you more, the infected when they were moving together, or those moments when everybody suddenly became still? I would genuinely love to hear how you read it. And if you enjoy conversations about films that go beyond whether they simply worked or failed, conversations about images, rhythm, emotion, and what cinema quietly understands about us, you are always welcome here. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like, subscribe, and come back when you are ready to sit with another film for a little while. Until then, keep noticing the details that refuse to disappear after the screen goes dark, because sometimes the most important thing a film leaves with us is not an answer. It is one small movement that makes us question everything we thought had stopped. That is the cineflux. I will see you in the next one.